January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the green mountains of Tennessee, the air smelled of wet pine and cold earth. Behind the double fences of barbed wire, beneath watchtowers manned by young American soldiers barely old enough to shave, a Japanese woman screamed. Not the scream of combat, not the scream of propaganda, the primal scream of childbirth, a sound that transcends nationality, ideology, and ward. In a makeshift clinic inside the prisoner of war compound, American military doctors moved with quiet efficiency. White coats, clean hands, sterile instruments arranged on metal trays that caught the pale winter light, streaming through frosted windows. Outside, the world was still at war. Inside this room, something older than war was taking place. The woman's name was recorded only as prisoner 4427B, wife of a captured Japanese merchant seaman. She had crossed an ocean believing in the divine destiny of the empire, believing Americans were demons in human skin, believing that capture meant dishonor worse than death. Now she lay on a clean bed with white sheets, an American physician's hand steadying her shoulder, his voice low and calm, telling her to breathe, telling her she was going to be fine, telling her in broken Japanese that her baby was crowning. She would never forget the softness of those sheets to understand this moment. We must step back to the opening days of the Pacific War, when Japan's military leadership crafted a narrative so complete, so totalizing, that millions believed it without question. The Americans, they were told, were a decadent race, weak from luxury, corrupted by democracy's chaos. They enslaved their prisoners, tortured them, desecrated their bodies. To surrender was not merely defeat. It was a fall into the hands of monsters. The Imperial Army's Field Service Code, issued in 1941, made it explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die, and leave no ignominious crime behind you. Surrender was erased from the lexicon of possibility. Japanese soldiers swallowed cyanide. They detonated grenades against their own chests. They charged into machine gun fire with bayonets raised, choosing annihilation over capture. When American forces overran positions on Saipan in 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians, mothers clutching infants, hurled themselves from cliffs into the Pacific rather than face what they believed awaited them below. This was not cowardice. This was indoctrination so profound it overwrote the survival instinct itself. Yet by January 1945, the mathematics of war had shifted. Island by island, the empire was collapsing. And despite the indoctrination, despite the shame, thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians were being captured alive, wounded, starving, broken. They arrived at American POW camps expecting torture chambers. They found something else entirely. The woman in Tennessee was one of approximately 40,000 Japanese nationals held in camps across the continental United States during the war's final years. Most were military prisoners. Some, like her, were civilians swept up in the Pacific Theater, merchant sailors' wives, embassy staff families, teachers from occupied territories. They arrived emaciated, diseased, traumatized by months of combat and flight. They arrived expecting the hell their commanders had promised. Instead, they were given medical examinations. The shock of it, the disorienting, reality-bending shock of it. American military doctors, the same doctors who treated wounded GIs, who worked 20-hour shifts in field hospitals splattered with the blood of boys from Iowa and Texas. These same doctors examined Japanese prisoners with the same clinical care. They treated tropical ulcers. They administered antibiotics for dysentery. They set broken bones. They inoculated against typhus and cholera. They did this not as propaganda, not as strategy, but as policy rooted in the Geneva Convention and something deeper, something the prisoners have been told did not exist in the American character, a belief that even enemies possessed inalienable human dignity. The pregnant women presented a particular challenge. Standard military doctrine had no protocol for this. The prisoners themselves could not comprehend it. When the first Japanese woman's labor began in a camp in New Mexico in late 1944, she refused medical assistance, believing a trick, a prelude to some unspeakable violation. She screamed for hours, alone in her barracks, until the pain became unbearable, and American medics, hearing her cries, intervened over her protests. They delivered her baby boy on a military cot under electric light. They cleaned him, weighed him, wrapped him in a standard-issue blanket, olive drab and scratchy but warm. They handed him to his mother, whose face displayed not gratitude but absolute incomprehension. She had expected her child to be taken, to be killed, to be used as leverage. Instead, the American doctor smiled a weary, genuine smile and said in halting Japanese, "Congratulations, he is healthy." She wept then, not from joy but from the collapse of her entire understanding of reality. This pattern repeated across the camp system. At Fort Livingston in Louisiana, American obstetricians delivered 6 Japanese babies in the spring of 1945. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, 2 more. Each birth followed the same protocol: full prenatal care, sterile delivery, postnatal monitoring. The mothers received supplemental rations, extra milk, eggs, fruit, to support lactation. The babies were issued birth certificates by the United States government, legal documents acknowledging their existence, their personhood, their right to life. The fathers, held in separate compounds, were informed of the births by American officers who shook their hands and offered cigarettes. Some of these men had fought at Guadalcanal. At Iwo Jima, they had killed Americans and had tried to die killing more. Now they stood in a prison yard in the American heartland, holding a Red Cross telegram announcing their child's arrival, an American guard saying, "Your wife is doing fine. You've got a son." One prisoner, a former sergeant in the Imperial Marines, later wrote his memoir, "I did not know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. The Americans had given me something the Empire never could, the knowledge that my child lived. But to accept this gift was to admit that everything I had believed, everything I had killed for, was a lie." This cognitive dissonance was the most powerful weapon America never intended to deploy. The medical care was only the beginning. The camps themselves, while austere, operated according to principles that seemed almost absurd to men raised under military dictatorship. Prisoners were fed 3 meals daily, rations equivalent to American soldiers, approximately 3,800 calories. They were given barracks with heating, beds with mattresses, blankets that did not rot with mildew. They were issued work clothes and, astonishingly, were paid for their labor, 80 cents per day in scrip for voluntary work details. They could purchase toiletries, stationery, cigarettes in the camp canteen. But it was the small, almost trivial details that shattered the propaganda most completely. The eggs at IN Japan. Even before the war, eggs were a luxury food, reserved for the sick or for special occasions. The average Japanese civilian might eat 1 egg per month if fortunate. In the POW camps, eggs appeared at breakfast, scrambled, fried, in sandwiches. Not every day, but regularly. Commonplace. An American abundance so profound it was given to prisoners without thought. One prisoner from Camp Shelby in Mississippi recalled his first breakfast. "I thought the eggs must be fake, made from chemicals. No nation could be so wealthy that it fed real eggs to its captives. But they were real. I could taste it. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to understand what kind of country could afford this." The eggs became a symbol, not of mercy. That implied condescension. A symbol of capacity, of an industrial and agricultural system so vast that even its imprisoned enemies ate better than Japanese soldiers in the field. The prisoners knew their own troops were starving on Pacific islands, chewing leather, boiling grass. They knew civilians in Tokyo were rationed 2 cups of rice per day. And here, in captivity, they ate eggs and bread, and occasionally meat, drank clean water from taps that never ran dry, and began to understand the terrible arithmetic of the war. Japan had challenged a nation that could afford to be generous to those who tried to destroy it. The woman in Tennessee, prisoner 4427B, delivered her daughter at 3:47 a.m. on January 17th, 1945. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Healthy lungs that announced themselves to the winter night with vigorous crying. The American doctor, Captain Robert Henshaw of the Army Medical Corps, had been awake for 19 hours. He had 3 children of his own back in Maryland, none of whom he had seen in 14 months. He held the Japanese baby in practiced hands, checked her reflexes, her color, her responsiveness, then placed her on her mother's chest, skin to skin, the way he'd learned in medical school, the way that transcended politics. "She's perfect," he said. The mother looked up at him, this enemy in uniform, this man whose country had firebombed Tokyo, whose submarines had starved her homeland, whose bombs would soon incinerate Hiroshima. She looked at him and saw exhaustion, professionalism, and something she had no context for, kindness without utility. "Why?" she whispered in Japanese. Captain Henshaw did not speak the language well, but he understood the question. He had heard it before, in different words, from other prisoners. Why treat us? Why care? Why not let us die? He cleaned his instruments, fatigue making his movements slow. Finally, he replied in English, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping the tone would carry. "Because you're a mother, and she's a baby. That's reason enough." The documentation of these births exists in military archives, requisition forms for infant formula, medical reports detailing umbilical care, photographs of Japanese mothers holding newborns in front of camp buildings marked with U.S. Army insignia. The photographs are jarring. The women's faces display complex emotions, relief, confusion, a haunted wariness, and sometimes, in the curve of a hand protecting a tiny head, something like trust. These images were not widely circulated during the war. They served no propaganda purpose. In fact, they complicated the narrative. Americans wanted to see their enemies as fanatics, as kamikazes, as subhuman Japs from newsreel caricatures. The image of American doctors delivering Japanese babies, of enemy mothers nursing in American hospitals, disrupted that simplicity. It suggested that war was more than good versus evil. It suggested that humanity persisted even in the machinery of violence, and that suggestion was dangerous to morale narratives both sides required. But the prisoners knew. Word spread through the camp networks, through the covert communications networks that prisoners always establish. The Japanese in Tennessee knew about the births in Louisiana. The prisoners in Wisconsin heard about the medical care in Arizona. And slowly, grudgingly, their understanding of America began to shift. Not that America was perfect. The racism was evident. The segregation of camps obvious. The barbed wire and guard towers undeniable. But the contrast between what they had been told and what they experienced was too vast to ignore. They had been promised savagery and received bureaucracy. They had expected torture and got paperwork. They had anticipated death and instead participated in the mundane routines of survival, work details, meal schedules, medical appointments, and occasionally births. After the war, many of these prisoners were repatriated to Japan, carrying memories that could not be reconciled with imperial propaganda. They returned to a shattered nation. Cities reduced to ash, economy in collapse, population starving. They returned carrying stories of American POW camps where they had been fed, clothed, and medically treated, where their children had been delivered by enemy doctors, where they had, against every expectation, survived with dignity. Some stayed silent, the shame of capture still too heavy. But others spoke, quietly, in private conversations that rippled through post-war Japan. They told their families about the eggs, about the medical care, about the American doctors who delivered Japanese babies with the same care they would deliver American babies. These testimonies contributed to a gradual, almost imperceptible shift in how Japan understood its former enemy, a shift that would eventually allow reconciliation, trade, alliance. The woman from Tennessee, her name finally recorded in post-war records as Akiko Matsumoto, was repatriated in October 1945. Her daughter, born in American captivity, was 4 months old. She carried the birth certificate, embossed, official, bearing the seal of the United States War Department, as if it were a talisman. In a sense, it was proof that even in war, even in the depths of ideological hatred, some principles held. Some laws applied to all humans regardless of which flag they served. Years later, in an interview conducted by historians documenting the POW experience, Akiko was asked what she remembered most about her captivity. She thought for a long moment, then replied, "The sheets, the white sheets on the bed where I gave birth. They were clean. I had not slept on clean sheets in 2 years. I did not know the Americans had such things. I did not know they would give them to someone like me. What changed in that Tennessee clinic was not policy. American treatment of prisoners was already governed by international law and military regulation. What changed was perception. the slow, irrevocable erosion of propaganda certainties when confronted with lived experience. The Japanese soldiers and civilians who witnessed American medical care, who ate American food, who saw American wealth deployed not just for destruction but for preservation, could no longer sustain the narrative of American barbarism. The evidence was too direct, too personal. You cannot be tortured by a nation and remember it incorrectly. You cannot be starved and misremember abundance. The physical reality of treatment overrode years of ideological conditioning, and the babies, those tiny, vulnerable symbols of life persisting through war, became something neither side had anticipated. Proof that beneath the machinery of total war, human impulses toward care and preservation endured. The American doctors who delivered those babies did not do so for strategic advantage. They did it because their training, their culture, their fundamental assumptions about human worth compelled them. In a nation that proclaimed all men created equal, that principle extended even to the children of enemies, born in captivity, citizens of nowhere, protected by nothing except the values the doctors carried, the eggs, the white sheets, the birth certificates. These were not grand gestures. They were not calculated acts of psychological warfare. They were the ordinary expressions of a system that, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated from assumptions about human dignity that the prisoners' home governments did not share. In the Empire of Japan, individual life was subordinate to state, to the emperor, to the collective mission. Surrender was worse than death because it removed the individual from usefulness to the whole. But in America, even a captured enemy retained rights, protections, humanity. This was not sentiment. It was law. It was structure. It was a bureaucratic expression of Enlightenment principles embedded so deeply in American institutions that even war could not fully erase them. The pregnant Japanese woman in Tennessee was not treated well because an individual doctor was unusually compassionate. She was treated well because the system, imperfect, often hypocritical, stained by its own racism and contradictions, nonetheless operated from foundational assumptions about human worth that dictated standards of care even for those who would try to destroy it. This is what the prisoners could not comprehend: generosity without personal relationship, care without affection, treatment as a matter of principle rather than feeling. In cultures where obligation was personal, where debt and reciprocity governed social relations, the American approach seemed incomprehensible. They were enemies. They owed each other nothing. Why, then, the medical care? Why the food? Why deliver the babies of those who had killed your sons? The answer: because the law requires it, because our principles demand it, because to do otherwise would diminish us, made no sense in a framework where the group's survival justified any individual's sacrifice. And on August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese heard in stunned, weeping silence. In the POW camps across America, the news arrived with different emotional texture. Relief, certainly, but also something more complicated. The prisoners had lost everything: their nation, their honor, their certainty. They faced repatriation to a devastated homeland with the shame of survival weighing on them. And yet, in the months and years they had spent in American captivity, something had shifted. They had learned that the enemy was human. That defeat did not mean annihilation. That systems existed which treated even the vanquished with a baseline of dignity. The babies born in those camps, Japanese by blood but American by birthplace, carried dual inheritances. They were living contradictions, products of war and proof that life persists beyond it. Most were repatriated with their parents, growing up in post-war Japan with American birth certificates tucked away in family archives, strange documents from a strange time, reminders that the world was more complex than any propaganda claimed that a few remained in America, adopted by American families when their imprisoned parents could not provide for them, when the shame of return was too great, when the practical calculations of survival overrode everything else. These children grew up American, their origins known to them only later, there existing a footnote in the vast ledger of war's displacements and reorganizations. But all of them, whether they knew it or not, were symbols of larger truth, that even in total war, even when nations mobilized every resource for mutual destruction, human impulses toward preservation and care found expression. The American doctors who delivered those babies did not stop the war. They did not change strategy or alter outcomes, but they demonstrated that the values a nation professes in peacetime persist, however imperfectly, into the chaos of conflict. And that persistence, that stubborn, bureaucratic, institutionalized refusal to abandon principle even when confronting enemies, was a form of power the imperial propaganda machine had never anticipated. In the end, what defeated Japan was not merely military force, though the force was overwhelming. It was not merely atomic weapons, though they were devastating. It was also the slow, accumulating realization that the enemy they had been told to hate was not the enemy they encountered, that the demons were men, that the weak were strong, that abundance was not a myth but a daily reality built on industrial capacity and resource wealth that Japan could never match. The prisoners who returned home carrying these realizations became, in small ways, agents of transformation. They could not speak openly in the immediate aftermath. The shame culture was too strong, the humiliation of defeat too raw. But in private conversations, in the quiet testimonies shared within families, in the gradual reconstruction of Japanese society under American occupation, their experiences mattered. They knew, firsthand, that Americans could be ruthless in war yet principled in victory, that American power came not just from bombs, but from systems that could afford generosity, that democracy, for all its chaos and contradictions, produced abundance that authoritarian efficiency could not match. The white sheets, the eggs, the babies delivered by enemy doctors in clean clinics. These became, in memory, symbols of a truth the war had proven, that nations built on the sovereignty of the individual, on the protection of rights even for enemies, on the institutionalization of human dignity into law and policy, possess a strength that went beyond firepower. They possess moral authority rooted in consistency between stated values and practiced behavior. Not perfect consistency. America's treatment of its own Japanese-American citizens during the war was shameful, a violation of the very principles the POW camps upheld. The contradiction was glaring, yet even imperfect adherence to principle exceeded the total abandonment of it. The Japanese prisoners in American camps were treated better than American prisoners in Japanese camps. This was not opinion. It was documented, measured, undeniable, and that disparity, more than any propaganda, told the truth about the two systems in conflict. January 17, 1945. A baby's cry in a Tennessee clinic. An American doctor exhausted but professional, fulfilling his duty. A Japanese mother holding her daughter, looking up at her captor, asking why. And in that moment, compressed into routine procedure childbirth, the entire ideological architecture of the Pacific War cracked. Not collapsed. Not yet, but cracked, because the woman would remember those sheets. The father would remember the congratulations. The baby would carry an American birth certificate into a Japanese future. And the accumulated weight of these small memories, multiplied across thousands of prisoners in hundreds of camps, would contribute to the post-war understanding that shaped the late 20th century, that America's power lay not just in its ability to destroy, but in its capacity to preserve even the lives of those who wished it destroyed. This was not mercy. This was something stranger and more powerful. This was a system that treated human dignity as a right rather than a privilege, that extended legal protections even to enemies, that delivered babies and filled breakfast plates, and provided medical care not because it felt like it, but because its foundational principles required it. The prisoners expected hell and found bureaucracy. They expected monsters and found exhausted doctors. They expected death and instead participated in the mundane miracle of birth. And in the gap between expectation and reality, an entire propaganda edifice collapsed, not everywhere, not for everyone, but for enough. For those who carried the memory of white sheets and clean clinics, of doctors who delivered babies and guards who offered cigarettes when they heard you become a father. For those who learned that abundance was real, that democracy produced wealth, that even captive enemies retained humanity protected by law. These were the lessons written not in treaties, but in experience. Written in the soft weight of a newborn placed in a mother's arms. Written in the taste of eggs at breakfast, in the warmth of blankets in winter, in the professionalism of doctors who treated wounds and delivered babies without asking which flag you served. And these lessons, more than any bomb, more than any strategic victory, shaped the peace that followed. Because the prisoners went home carrying knowledge, that they had been lied to, that the enemy was human, that some nations built power not just on force but on principles that persisted even into captivity. The baby born in Tennessee that January night carried none of this weight consciously. She was simply born, simply held, simply nursed. But her birth certificate, that bureaucratic artifact embossed with official seals, testified to something larger, that even in the depths of total war, the machinery of American democracy continued to recognize human dignity, to document human life, to extend protection to the powerless. This was the America the prisoners never expected to meet. And meeting it changed everything.